Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 196, The Acts of the Author.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build.
Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And
why do I obsess on doing that?
I don't know. I was going to say I, without a stutter, am Michael Miller.
Very good. Yes. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about building the world.
And destroying the world. We don't talk about that one nearly enough.
We don't, which is ironically 3 of our best rated episodes. So we might have to blow the world up again just to try and recapture the magic downloads.
The magic. Rebottle the lightning.
That's right.
So what are we talking about today?
So today, people are all the time talking about like story structures, which I don't know why. Just write the story. It's that simple. But okay, I guess there are some certain structures you can use. There are actually lots of different structures you can use. It's sort of a technique on how to frame a story in a rhythm that you know that works. So if you're planning to share your story with people, it's best to find one of these that work well with your storytelling style so you can best tell your story in a way that has worked several times. And the two biggies on the block, I think the two biggest ones you have to start with are the 3-act structure and the 5-act structure. And it's pretty simple. You have, in a 3-act structure, these 3 points of the plot that happen. 2 of them are really important and hook you and make you go further into the story, and then it's done. And in a 5-act structure, you have 4 of those things that keep pulling you through the story that are kind of big, and then you sort of wrap it up at the end. So that is, well, I guess that's really it there. So that's your 3 and 5-act structures all done.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
Yep, have a good night, folks.
Jeff, do you want to list what the 3 things are and what the 5 things are, at least?
You mean like actually go into detail?
No, just list them.
Nah. Yeah, I guess maybe we should go on a bit more detail here. So, a 3-act structure. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I was literally going to say the exact same thing. Go ahead. I was going to say, 3-act structure.
So essentially, 3-act structure, this is sort of modern movie and television gold. If you watch a television show, if you watch a movie, in the U.S., definitely. Maybe not so much if it's a miniseries or a really long movie, I don't know. And Michael's better at this stuff than I am, so he'll let me know if I'm wrong. But this is pretty much your standard screenplay kind of structure. But people do use it for other storytelling techniques. I think it's becoming more popular in novels today because at least Americans have shorter attention spans. So it's best to sort of propel into the story. So essentially, in a 3-act structure, you kind of start off with the setup. And it'll incorporate some of the background of the world, but as it's doing it, it will start building up tension into the story, and it will kind of get you to the point of knowing what is the premise of the story here. Where are we going?
Also, you're going to introduce your main characters, like who's the protagonist or who are we going to follow, and you're definitely going to figure out what perspective you're going to be following through the story.
Yeah.
So are you listening to a narrator? Are you getting it through the first-person perspective of the main character?
Mm-hmm. And so here is my famous example for a 3-act structure will be Star Wars. And so essentially, blah, 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 a bunch of stuff happens, yada, yada, yada. But ultimately, Ben and Luke go to save Princess Leia. That's your first act. So essentially, all of the stuff, starships blowing up and droids being sent off with messages, the whole point is to let you understand that there's this guy, Luke. and he's this young punk kid who's actually a part-time desert raider, I believe.
I don't give him that much credit. The Raiders are cool. The Raiders are cool.
The Sandman.
He was. Do you know the real truth of Luke in when he says that he wants to join the Academy? He's referring to
the Imperials,
the Imperial Academy. He wanted to join the war fighting for the Empire.
Of course he did, because he is an evil character. They try and loft him off as this good guy, but they're just showing you from his perspective. The Sand People are the good people, and
oh yeah, no doubt,
they get shorted in the story, but it's just all perspective thing. But the idea that Lucas wanted to give you was that Luke's this good guy, and he's going to go with Ben to save Princess Leia. And so all of the things that happen help push you to that point, but that's what hooks you in to go, we got to see them save Princess Leia. And it's a really good hook, because you really believe that Luke's a good guy, and you really believe that Princess Leia is a good person, and that you're on the right side.
And you look at the very, very beginning of the movie, you get all the most important characters in the first few minutes. You get Vader, Leia, you shortly thereafter you get Luke, and then Ben, and of course C-3PO and R2-D2, who are, the most important characters in the Star Wars universe. Everybody knows this.
The most important characters, yes.
And then
they express too, later, Vader's evil, straight up front.
No mystery who the bad guy is.
No mystery on who they're showing as the bad guy is Lord Vader, everyone's favorite protagonist, not antagonist. He's really the protagonist. Once again, he just gets slimed by Lucas.
Let's not make this explanation too complicated. So we're still on the first act of the three act structure.
Actually, stop being a fiction writer. Actually, stop lying.
Introduction. Well, basically what we're covering is in the first act of a story of a tale, you're going to get the introduction. You're going to get the main characters. You're usually going to get usually in the second you get the conflict, but I find a lot of stories you find out what the conflict is right off the rip.
You typically know what the conflict is, and the setup is going to tell you why you're going to follow the characters into the actual conflict. So the conflict itself is really going to be your second act. And the climax will come a little bit after the end of the second act, but or somewhere after the end. Sometimes climaxes come right near the very end, but usually not quite that late in.
Sometimes climaxes don't come at all. Poor girl. Sorry,
I hate when that happens to me. I'll just fake it. But
because you lie.
That's right. I'm a fiction writer and I lie.
I'm a fiction writer. I lie.
Oh, it was good for me. Okay. So you get into the second act of a 3-act structure, and that's the actual confrontation. It is the major conflict. Now, you're going to have subplots and stuff like that weave in and out, and they're probably going to follow a 3-act structure in a 3-act story, but they're going to have their own rhythms. And, and some of them, and multiple ones might actually come to head at the actual climax of the story. I think some stories do that very well. Other stories don't do it that way, but it works out for the storytelling that you're doing to have the climax of subplots happen when they need to happen. Sometimes it'll help propel the plot forward. Sometimes it will add that twist that comes in at the end of the second. It's not always necessarily a twist, but it's a bigger hook that really helps define the resolution that needs to come out. And so when you're watching Star Wars, when you're done with the second act, there is a twist. And so there's going to be, what do you call a spoiler here? In case you haven't seen Star Wars. So you'll want to go see Star Wars if you haven't seen this one yet. But Ben Kenobi dies.
The point here is that the bulk of your tale is going to be the second act.
It's going to be the second act, and the idea, and really the story of Star Wars is Luke and a band of people going onto the Death Star to find Leia. But because of learning what they found on the Death Star, it leads to the final confrontation at the end, which is in the resolution, which is the third part. But you sort figure out that, they escape this mighty death station, the Death Star. Ben dies, which is sort of a twist to help make it more emotionally impactful. And the characters are left with no choice but to destroy the Death Star.
No choice. Got to do it.
No choice. Got to do it. And so the third act is the resolution. So this is where your big story climax happens. It's usually, I don't know. I usually think they're sort of about halfway through the resolution on average. But like some stories will really they'll hold up and like there's very little. And I don't like that. I like it to wrap up the main characters and where they're going. And Star Wars did that relatively effectively in a short period of time. So it can be, the climax can be near the end, but that's the final battle. Inside the resolution, the main part of the resolution of Star Wars is the destruction of the Death Star. And spoiler, if you haven't seen Star Wars. Really, there's no pity if you haven't seen Star Wars at this point. I would be shocked if you're listening to the show and you've never watched Star Wars. Even if you're one of those people who say they don't like it. But that's essentially a 3-act structure. So you get your setup, essentially and the point thing is your plot points, there are many things that you tell in a story, but your plot points are the things that compel you deeper. So, and if you're telling a good story at the end of the setup, you know enough to know why you need to follow the characters into the conflict. You need to understand how you want the audience to feel about that. These are the things that you're trying to do in the first part. In the second part, you're really telling the conflict. And sure, you're trying to hide and bring surprises in. Of course, you're doing all of that. But you're trying to get to essentially the resolution. But through doing that, you need typically a twist or something else to propel you to get to the actual resolution of the story. And so the confrontation section's really about that. And in there near the end, you're trying to hook them in to get into the resolution to see that final climactic moment of the story. It's like really fiction writing is like any type of marketing. You're just trying to get them to the next point, except your line, it's all made up stuff, which makes it easier to do without being sued.
And I tell people it's really not hard. It's really easy just to keep everybody into it and engaged in your story. You just have to make it a point to have everything that you write be interesting.
Yeah, just make it all interesting.
Just make it all interesting, and then you won't have any problems. People will want to read it. And
understand, you're going to have 3 major points in a 3-act structure. That's why you call it a 3-act structure. You need 3 important points, something to really speed up the story in that confrontation phase to bring you into that part. And even if it's like the story where it's going to be, just like 2 people having a conversation around a table in a 3-act structure story, there's some kind of confrontation between the people, something they're talking about. And it might not even be an argument, but that's how stories get propelled forward is through conflict. So maybe it's a disagreement on what they're going to watch on television. It does not matter what it is as long as you can write it. Like Michael said, follow Michael's tips, make it all interesting. And it doesn't really matter, but you need 3 major points in a 3-act structure to keep propelling the story forward. And that's really what you're trying to do.
And don't confuse the word conflict with combat. Combat certainly occurs, and sometimes a major conflict is combat, but I've fallen in love with stories where the main conflict is literally opposing ideals between 2 mutually characters that respect each other. They understand each other, they respect each other, they just disagree.
There's a great scene I'm going to reference here that's a 3-act story subplot. And so, but I like it because it sums up a 3-act story very quickly. It is from Good Will Hunting. And it is where I don't know if Will meets the girl whose name I can't remember now. At the bar. Played by Minnie Driver at the bar. He goes to the bar. They introduce very quickly that there are some wicked smart college guys.
He's wicked smart.
But the thing is, they're like pseudo intellectual smart. Will is really very intelligent. He's just a blue collar guy.
Proto hipsters is what I like to.
They're sort of like an intellectual version of the evil '80s jock villains.
Yes,
was what this,
yes, yes, they are.
Is essentially what this guy was, and so essentially, there's the confrontation is essentially Will goes into an intellectual battle with the guy to impress the girl. Will wins. He gets the number. The resolution is he goes up, he slams the number up on the window and goes, "Hey, how about them apples?" and walks away with the phone number. But that's a quick 3-act subplot within a 3-act story.
It's a great example.
Yeah, I can't believe I actually thought of something useful on the fly.
Yeah, it's really short. It takes a few minutes within the scene. But yeah, I mean that's something that you're gonna repeat throughout. Certainly a novel, you're gonna repeat the 3-act structure throughout it. Like you're gonna have miniature stories, and each one of those stories,
all your subplots will probably follow the same 3-act structure. And I would say, even if you're doing a 5-act structure, you probably don't want to do 5-act subplots. You're probably going to do 3-act subplots.
I would agree.
But, then again, write your story the way you want to because it's yours. Now, the 5-act, rhythm-wise, is the same, right? So you have a setup, a confrontation, and a resolution, but it does it in a little bit different rhythm. So essentially, you have this idea, you have the BSing part at the beginning. I have no idea. Exposition. I can't ever say that word.
Exposition?
Exposition, thank you.
Okay.
You have the exposition at the beginning. And this is a part that I think is falling out of favor a bit. And fantasy novels are very big for this. This is the part where you introduce the kingdom. This is the part where you introduce all the characters. There's one really... maybe you've heard of this writer before. I don't know. I'm going to throw the name out there. Maybe you've heard of him. There's one person that I kind of think of when I think of a 5-act structure. And let me know if you've not heard of him, Mike, and maybe we'll have to find someone else. Shakespeare.
What?
William Shakespeare.
Billy Shakespeare.
No,
Never
William. Okay. Well, crap. I'll just use him anyway. Maybe someone in the audience has actually heard of this Billy Shakespeare guy.
I mean, I doubt it. I'm pretty well read.
What movies did he make?
What movies? He's actually made quite a few.
Well, quite a few movies have been made, but one of the reasons movies sometimes I think struggle is because movies are made in a 3-act structure. Shakespeare, all of his work is a 5-act structure. And we're going to take this little-known work of his called The Tempest, and we will quickly break that down in about 5 lines, one for each, and then Michael will come up with really clever things that he can think of along the way, too.
I'm going to try, but I've actually never read The Tempest.
Very good. So, you can come from other parts where things, things that ring your bell from anywhere you want to.
I'll do the best I can. Go ahead.
So when you're starting off, the first act is about giving enough backstory, so you kind of have an idea of the characters and kind of their perspective going into the action, and I think, and this is just me, I have sort of a hybrid 3 to 5-act structure thing that I use, but I try and smush all 5 structures into 3. So, this phase to me would be spread out throughout the book. It would not be all up front. But this is, sort of like what Michael said, with the setup, it's that first part where you're saying the characters, you're saying where they're from, and you're given an idea of what the harm is. So essentially, the idea in this part is you learn there's this really big freaking storm, and there's these 3 guys, Antonio being the key one of them, who is they're kind of freaked out about this really bad storm at sea. And so and you also learn that there's this villainous villain called Prospero who has actually summoned this storm.
So he's magic.
So he is a mage. So this is actually early fantasy, folks. And now the cool thing is the next part is sort of the rest of the setup. So these two things are the setup in a 3-act structure, but it's rising action. So you start getting up to bringing the conflict up and bringing up the tension of the story is really probably the better way to say it, or building up for your punchline is what you're doing in the rising action. So the action will start to pick up, and essentially the idea here is the boat wrecks, and his brother, who is I think Ferdinand and Antonio. All of these, there's so many characters in this, it's ridiculous. But there's a shipwreck, and essentially Prospero is trying to punish his brother and the King of Naples, who happen to be two people on the ship that he's wrecking, onto this magical desert island. Not really desert island, but a magical island in the middle of nowhere. But this way he can trap them. And within that too, his brother's going to start falling in love with a female character whose name I don't have written down in front of me and I can't remember. And the idea is they're going to start falling in love. Prospero will be so angry at this, and this will help propel the action forward.
Now, why is he angry at this?
He's not at all. This is actually part of his plan. He plays it off as he's angry because his brother has betrayed him in the past, which is why he's trying to punish him.
Oh, I see.
And so, it's an old book, so this is all part of his plot. To get him to start falling in love, to get her to marry someone else, and it's this frustrating back and forth kind of stuff. So, and I'm completely misrepresenting this because it's been so long. I do apologize. I will have to rewatch The Tempest, which there was one a couple of years ago, which I've never seen, which I'm going to have to go find now. Okay, because it's strange. You don't see this one done a lot because it's big. There's magic, right? Then, the climax is sort of the big, sort of where the tension's at the highest. It's not the resolution of the story. It's not getting you through the problem, but it's bringing it all to the top where there's like everyone's running around like a Scooby-Doo episode from room to room, and they're trying to get to Prospero's room, and they got led into like the swamp and by Ariel, which is like this like tough ass pixie that works for Prospero, and there's like spirits all over the place. Prospero keeps throwing at these people. People start to disappear all over the place, and it's all going very poorly. They get into actually they don't get into his bedroom yet, but they're all trying to get to Prospero because they do know he's the villain, and then he throws on some wacky, creepy banquet, and Ariel then shows up because everyone's there getting drunk at the banquet, because that's what you do when there's a banquet. You get drunk, even if you're on a creepy island with a magic user. And Ariel shows up, and Antonio and some of the other people, she's like, I'm going to whoop you. I'm going to whip you hard. And so that's the big climactic moment, basically. I'm pretty much nailing Shakespeare right here. Okay. But
nailed it.
Nailed it. I'm sure everyone felt the emotion of that climactic. But
all right. So now retell that in just a few sentences and identify what would be your act one, your act two.
So what your act one, your background story is telling you about the characters on the ship in Prospero. Who are the main characters? Why is there the conflict between them? Then in Act 2 is the rising action. And that's the part where the boat gets wrecked, and then all of a sudden things start to happen to the characters, which are propelling them towards the what you think of as the confrontation. And then you get the Act 3 is sort of the confrontation itself, which is this crazy scene going across all over this island, with a creepy banquet, and Ariel showing up going, I'm going to whip you three people's butts. This is really why everything's happening. But now you're not ready for the resolution yet. You start to have the action fall off. You start to bring the tension down a little bit again in a 5-act structure, and they call it falling action. So it's Act 4. And here you learn that Prospero says okay to the marriage that he was so opposed to early on. And it was really one of his goals. And you start to learn that maybe there's more to Prospero than just this evil villainous character that you got in the first 3 acts. And then there's also a part in there where a couple of the guys who are really drunk get distracted by clothing. It's Shakespeare. What can I say?
Get distracted by clothing?
Really, really beautiful clothing, though. It's like, wow, this is really beautiful. But then, of course, they all finally get to Prospero's bedroom with some drunk guys who are distracted by clothing at that point. Prospero and Ariel show up with a bunch of demon death dog hounds, we'll say, to make it sound more impressive, and they scare him and chase him off. But so it's kind of like you're bringing the action down a bit from the climax, and you're really spreading out the resolution because that's kind of what you're getting to in the 5th act, which is still the resolution, which is really you kind of learn that Prospero started to feel guilty because he was beating everyone so badly, and people are disappearing, and you think they're dead, and he starts going, no, they're not really dead, here they are. And Ariel and this other thing, that I've been controlling with magic, and they're really powerful spirits that really make it impossible for you guys to have a chance to beat me. I'm going to release them. And I'm going to give one heck of a great speech. I'm going to snap my staff. I'm going to drown my magic book. And then I'm going to beg the audience for applause, because that's kind of what you did in an old-fashioned play. Because if you give him applause, he can then be freed, from the prison he caused himself in the Tempest. So because he essentially gave up, which to me, I like the Tempest. It's a good story, but it was never one of my favorite endings, because it was kind of like literally to me, it's like the villain was like, yeah. I feel guilty. I'm not going to do this now. But they alluded to that in the falling action, so maybe it was brilliant. Maybe it was just I have no way, as the writer, he had no way to get out of it. But that is a classic structure. So you tell a lot of the backstory. You introduce the characters and the interactions between them. Then you start bringing up the action. To me, that's Act 1 and Act 2 in a 5-act structure. And it's kind of like the setup, but a little bit more stretched out. There's typically not a lot of action when you're introducing stuff at the beginning, until you get to the action rising, and then there will be a bit more action, and then you get into the climax portion, which is big, massive, action going on there, and then you bring it down a little bit because you're trying to control the audience's emotion, so you can emotionally bring them into the resolution however you want them. And so especially if you want to show that Prospero is not just a crazy villain that can't be stopped, you need to get into that falling action. The plot point there is to help show that there's maybe something more to him.
So so that's 3 acts. So
actually up to 4. The falling action's an act of its own.
Right. So you have introduction,
rising
conflict.
Rising action, and then climax. So the conflict's really broken down into 3 parts: rising action, the climax, and falling action.
Okay. All right. I got you.
And then resolution at the end. So those are your 5 freaking acts. And to me, it's like you need a little bit of the world stuff, but I don't feel like you need to structure it all at the beginning of the book. I like to deliver it from the perspective of what's important to the characters, and as it becomes relevant. And so if I need it for something else, I need to get to it before it becomes more relevant. If it needs explaining, because at that climactic scene, you don't want to be explaining, the importance of the ceremony to the culture. You want, at that point, it's like, bam, wow, a massive thing is happening. That's what you're focused on. So you have to take care of all of the elements so that people understand why that's so important when they get there. And you're just telling the resolution and the actual moment, the actual climax of your story. The falling action, to me, I kind of do with resolution, and sometimes I do it like following the resolution, and sometimes I do it leading up to the resolution. It all depends on how you want the emotions to be carried. It's like when I've talked about high drama in the past, is like you want to peak them up and bring them down, peak them up, bring them down, because each time you can add more tension. Anytime you're trying to add tension or emotions, you have to do that. You have to peak it up, bring it back. And that way, each time the person can suspend their disbelief and they can go a little further in. They can get sucked in a little bit more. And so, whether or not you use a 3 or a 5 act, or you're like me and you sort of squish 5 acts into 3, it's important that you have all these points. And for each of those, you need its own transition. Those are your plot points. You don't have 1,000 plot points for a 3-act structure. You have 3. You have 5 for a 5-act structure. That's why they're that. And there are other types of storytelling structures. Don't get me wrong. But these are, I think, are the 2 most common I hear people talk about. I think 5 is probably a bit more common in literature. I just don't think it reflects most people who read today. Most people who read today watch more television and movies than they do reading. And so if you interrupt it from a 3-act and add too much of the rest of the stuff in there, I don't know how they'll react, but you can always let me know if you go with a more traditional 5-act structure. So, and it definitely is the standard in fantasy. You get slapped up front. Tolkien was a huge 5-act guy as well. So, but just go through, and sort of think about which one would fit a little bit better for you. And when you're starting off, it doesn't matter how you write it out. Write it out however you feel most comfortable, and you can deal with stuff in editing. So now to the world building task of the day.
Create 2 outlines. I bet you can guess what kind we want to see. 1 for 3-act and 1 for 5-act. And then, have that be an outline for your work, your current work in progress. And then, consider what they are and what which one makes you see your story better.
Yeah. Because I think that's a big thing, especially for more novice writers, is the more you can visualize your story, yourself, the easier it becomes to write that story. So which one makes more sense to you? Which rhythm makes more sense to you? And so write out an outline both ways. Start with your plot points, right? And then start adding in the scenes of the things that you need to accomplish before you get to those plot points. That's how you do it. And then for the real world task of the day, you're going to have to do this one with me. Go watch I think it's a 2010 movie, The Tempest. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Oh, 2010
so if you use it, it'll give us a little affiliate kickback.
2010 is pretty recent. I'm going to have to check that out myself.
Yeah. No, there's currently one on Amazon, and it will be in the show notes. So, and I'll put a couple links to people who are more academic, who have, a lot more, because, these ideas aren't new. They're both very old. And at some point, we'll probably revisit some other techniques. But remember, the structures you create your book in, you have to be able to tell stories to use them. So, I'll go back to this one last time. If you're struggling telling stories, just write a story. Don't worry about the structure. Don't try and, don't make it any more clever than it is. Just write about a conflict. That's a good way to practice. And then once you get comfortable doing that, add to it. Make it more complicated. Go, okay, let me do a setup here. Let me, and do some research. Like TV Tropes has a lot of good things on this. There are a lot of good ideas out there on how to do these ideas. But start researching ideas that you think are appealing and then try and implement them. But tell your stories first. Either out loud to people or write them down. And if you want to be a writer, do writing. But practice storytelling. Then add in structures to formalize it.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil. We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends, and so would they. If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting by showing them Stitcher or iTunes, or, best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.